The tennis courts at Greenwood Park had a way of holding the day. As the sun slid down behind the sycamores, the chain-link fence blurred the last of the light into a soft golden haze. On most evenings, the courts belonged to nobody and everybody at once. Pickup games, teenagers with beaten rackets, parents teaching toddlers how to hold a racket. They were municipal ground, a shared patch of pavement where the town's small dramas and small joys played out. It was on one of those late, quiet summer evenings that Officer Ryan Hayes noticed a woman on Court 2. She moved with a careful rhythm, sneakers whispering, arm arcing in a practiced backhand. He had seen players before, kids, joggers sneaking a volley. But something about this woman's steady, unhurried practice pulled at the part of him trained to pay attention. Ryan was a community officer. He patrolled Greenwood not to flex authority but to keep friction low. Stray dogs, loose gates, noise complaints. He respected rules. The town had a simple ordinance: no unsanctioned use after dusk. Lights were off, signs clear. He approached with his flashlight and his best calm. The sort of approach that diffused potential fights before they began. He did not expect to be about to learn a lesson in humility. Officer Ryan Hayes was 32, 5 years on the force, honest to a fault and quick to be practical. He knew most of the regulars in Greenwood by name: Mrs. Patel with her morning yoga, the Garcias who played doubles religiously on Saturdays, and the local high school coach who used Court 1 for drills. Ryan liked the rhythm of the place. He liked when everyone followed the small rules that let a town hum along. Evelyn Eve Hartwell looked, at first glance, like any grandmother you might see watering her window boxes, silver hair pulled into a neat bun, a sweatband pressed against her brow, and a faded purple windbreaker tied over her shoulders. But up close her hands told a different story, calloused at the fingertips, wrist flexed with muscle memory, and eyes that had a steady, deliberate focus. She had been playing tennis since a child, a lifetime's worth of hours at court edges and backhands. Some of it in professional leagues decades earlier, some in community tournaments, most of it just for the love of the game. Greenwood's public courts had not always looked the same. Once pristine, they'd fallen into slow disrepair over 10 years, broken nets, graffiti, lights that flickered out, and an indifferent parks department budget. When a local developer smelled profit, plans to turn half the park into condominium units had surfaced. The town was small. The developer had friends on the council and a smooth, polished plan. Most folks shrugged. Things change, they said. Eve did not shrug. She had watched children trip on loose net posts. She had seen her neighbors relocate to the next town when their kids had nowhere safe to play. She'd also seen what the courts did for a different corner of Greenwood, a late-night program where teens who might otherwise be on the streets learned drills, discipline, and the kernel of self-worth that comes from being coached by someone who believes in you. If Eve had the means, she decided she would save the courts. Ryan's cruiser idled by the curb, headlights off, the radio murmuring with background calls. He hopped the low fence and trod across the cracked asphalt toward Court 2. The dusk had thinned to dim. A single overhead lamp hummed weakly, eating the shadows but not quite pushing them back. "Evening," he called, approaching with the professional smile. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Hayes with Greenwood PD. City ordinance says courts are closed after dusk." Eve pivoted, racket in hand, and gave a small, polite nod. "Good evening, officer." Ryan felt the small relief of a cooperative citizen. Then something atypical, her posture, the steadiness in her voice, the easy way she set her weight into her feet, as if the night court was as much a part of her as a gardener's gloves were to a gardener. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he continued. "The park rules are the rules." Eve set the racket down. She was quiet for a moment, and Ryan expected the usual script, an apology, a quick retreat. What followed was not that. "I'm not here for myself," she said simply. "I'm coaching." Ryan blinked. "Coaching? There's no program registered tonight." "There's no program on paper," Eve admitted. "Doesn't mean it isn't happening. I've been running free lessons here for months." The conversation might have ended there, a polite, awkward exchange. But a soft shuffle behind him grew into the rustle of teenagers emerging from the trees, rackets clattering and faces flushed. One by one, they came out of the gloom. Marcus, the local kid who'd stopped hanging out by the corner store since Eve started bringing him drills. Jada, whose school attendance had improved. Malik, who had stopped getting into trouble. "She's ours," one of them said, blunt and proud. "She helps us." Ryan's duty pulled him in two directions. He could enforce the rule and risk pushing these kids away from something that looked like stability. He could give a courteous warning and walk on. He could also write a ticket. The simple, professional answer felt clearer. Rules were rules. "So you don't have a permit," he said. "You must have authorization to use community facilities after hours." Eve's voice was thin but steady. "I don't have a permit because the people who control the permits were about to sell the land. I bought it. I own it." Ryan's jaw tightened. "What do you mean you own it?" "This is a city park," Eve smiled faintly. "It was. I didn't want it to stop being a place for kids. I raised the money, I closed the deal, and I put it into a trust so the courts can't be sold again." The teenagers murmured, incredulous. "She owns the whole thing?" Marcus asked. Ryan felt the floor tilt in an instant. If it was true, he'd made the mistake of assuming authority where it did not belong. 100 small images of his training flicked through his head. Check facts, do not assume, read the evidence, respect the community. Protocol was simple. Verify property ownership through dispatch if in doubt. He stepped back microscopically, radio in hand, and said, "Hold on. I'm going to confirm that." The streetlight buzzed overhead as Ryan clicked the radio and called dispatch. The night dispatcher, patient with the routine of late calls, promised to check property records. Ryan watched the teens laugh, stretching rackets at their sides. Eve sat on the bench like she'd been doing this for decades, which, in fact, she had. Within 15 minutes, dispatch pinged back. A parcel number, a deed, and a note that a private trust, the Hartwell Community Trust, did hold title to the land for the township parcel that contained courts 1 through 4, the county clerks. Scanned document popped up on Ryan's cruiser laptop like an uninvited truth. He handed the tablet to Eve, with an apologetic nod. Her hands were steady as she tapped the document, revealing the signature of the mayor and a stack of affidavits. She'd moved quietly and carefully, gathering support and signatures. "Working late in the evenings to patch legal holes. You could have just told me," Ryan said, feeling the heat of embarrassment rise under his uniform collar. "We didn't have to." "This way," Eve's expression softened. "And then you'd have called it a private court and sent kids home? Sometimes the law moves slower than what's right." "I did what I could do." The teens crowded around the tablet, their skepticism melting into awe. Ryan listened as Eve explained the trust, how she'd pooled donations from alumni, a local nonprofit, and her modest savings. How she'd negotiated with the town to buy the parcel when the council waffled on whether to preserve green spaces. How she'd stipulated that the courts remain open to the public, prioritizing youth programs and then ensuring a clause that would prevent future sale to developers. This changes things," Ryan said, throat tight. "I'm sorry I acted like my first impulse was to be a cop first." Eve's laugh was warm and oddly forgiving. "We all have roles, Officer Hayes. You're paid to notice when rules are broken." "I'm paid, in a manner of speaking, to notice when rules become a shield for greed." But the story did not end with a tidy apology. The county deed proved Eve owned the land now, but other actors still had power and influence. The Parks Department ledger still showed a proposed sale to the developer. There were invoices and lobbying emails, and, more ominously, whispers that a couple of council members expected cutbacks if they deviated from the developer's plan. When Ryan did his homework, he found a line item, an agreement the town had nearly signed, with a clause allowing a private contractor to maintain the grounds and schedule usage, effectively privatizing daytime slots and squeezing out free programs. Eve's purchase had thrown a wrench into a plan that had quietly been moving forward for months. What infuriated Ryan was not that an attempt had been made. That was to be expected in any place where profit and public service bumped shoulders. What cut deeper was that a few municipal employees had been treating the whole thing as inevitable, leaning on rules in a way that prioritized process over people. Eve had known this would happen. She'd bought the parcel to stop the obvious. If the land were sold, kids like Marcus and Jada would lose the only safe place they had for a few hours of structure and mentorship. She'd argued with the council, sometimes loudly, sometimes by filing paperwork at 2 a.m. She'd held bake sales and benefit nights. She'd made enemies, too. The developer's people were patient and persuasive. Ryan sat in his cruiser. Late that night, the world around him small and private, thinking about how easy it can be to mistake enforcement for justice. The badge doesn't always shine a light on the nuance. Over the next weeks, Ryan did something that surprised even himself. Instead of writing up a report and clearing the file, he began to show up. Sometimes it was a quick cup of coffee with Marcus as the kids stretched at dawn. Sometimes he helped set up cones for drills. Once he stayed for a Saturday session and watched Eve work the kids like a gardener tending a bed. Careful pruning, encouragement, a firm hand when needed, never a yell, but always an insistence on trying one more time. He watched Jada's footwork bloom, watched Malik's stare soften when he finally connected a forehand. He watched the way the kids folded into the program as if it were salvage. Each served and volleyed ball a small claim on a future that otherwise might have been filled with aimless risk. Ryan also sat down with Eve. He asked about her life beyond the courts, early tournaments, stumbles in business, the funeral where she'd resolved to make a difference. Eve spoke without self-importance. She spoke about a husband who'd died, young, about a long career as a coach in small leagues, and about a stubborn conviction that public space should remain public in spirit, even if technically private. "You don't strike me as a troublemaker," Ryan told her once. "You just do the hard thing." Eve tilted her head. "I'm not above being stubborn. I just try to be useful. That's a dangerous word in some circles. Useful. People confuse being useful with being entitled. I've learned to keep one eye on both." That frankness wove its way into Ryan's thinking. It was not just Eve's ownership that mattered. It was the reason behind it. Eve had not hoarded access. She'd legally protected access. The developer did not vanish. When the council took up the final clause that might have favored privatization, the room swelled. Evenings filled with community testimony and petitions. Someone had started a small online petition with over 1,000 signatures. The developers, lobbyists showed, slick and practiced, and council members who had once shrugged looked suddenly nervous in the glare. On the night the vote came up, the chamber was packed. Eve stood near the front, hands clasped. Ryan sat in the back in plain clothes, along with half a dozen kids, neighbors, and a clutch of parents who had seen what the courts did for their kids. The room smelled of coffee and nervous hope. When the developer's representative rose to speak, he delivered the familiar litany of promises: jobs, tax base, modern amenities. It had the practiced cadence of a sales pitch. Then Eve stood. She did not shout. She did not wave legal papers or rattle off figures first. She told the room about Marcus, the boy who'd been slipping through his classes until the court gave him a schedule. She told them about Jada, who was now captain of her school's team and was the first in her family with a scholarship application stuffed in her backpack. "Those kids are not tax base," she said. "They are people. They are ours." Her voice was small but steady. The fact that she had come as both a private citizen and a private owner complicated the straightforward public versus private debate. Ryan found himself standing when she finished, as if moved by something larger than property titles. The council voted. The clause that threatened to privatize access was struck down. A narrow victory, but a victory nonetheless. The developer stormed out, and the lobbyist smiled legally but not warmly. Eve hugged Marcus in the courthouse hallway, while the kids who'd gathered around her cried and laughed. Later, in the dim parking lot, Ryan approached her with a bottle of water and a sheepish grin. "I owe you a better first impression," he said. Eve took the bottle and, with a small laugh, replied, "You owe them a better watch, Officer Hayes. The best policing is seeing why rules exist and when they hurt people." The courts did more than reopen that summer. They transformed. Eve's trust-funded maintenance, a small roofed bench for rainy evenings, new nets, and a modest stipend for a young assistant coach. The town cooperated, partly shamed and partly invigorated by the community's energy. The Parks Department, nudged by public pressure, rewrote its permit process to be more transparent and responsive. A few municipal employees who'd favored profit over people were quietly reassigned. The kids continued to show up. The rackets kept clicking. Ryan's patrols changed too. He still enforced ordinances, but now he paused longer before reaching for his ticket book. He walked court edges and listened. Once, he knelt in the dirt to tie Malik's shoe and found himself explaining the geometry of court angles to a kid who'd never thought of physics before. His relationship with Eve deepened into an easy friendship. She teased him about his unpracticed serve. He teased her about the way she always wore the same purple windbreaker on windy days. More importantly, they saw in each other an ally, two people whose jobs put them in positions of authority, finding that humility and listening were often the instruments of real change. At a small commemorative event the next spring, the town installed a simple plaque. Hartwell Courts, dedicated to play, fair access, and every child's second chance. Eve stood with the kids as they cut a ribbon. Ryan was at her side, clapping, camera ready in the hands of a parent. Marcus hit the first ceremonial ball, and it sailed over the net into a chorus of cheers. Inside the hush between rallies and votes, life had inched forward in Greenwood. The courts kept their role as a hinge, swinging children, neighbors, and local officers into new patterns of care. The lesson that summer was quietly, insistently simple. Authority without curiosity can crush, but curiosity without responsibility can flounder. The balance lay in people who were willing to check their assumptions, to step back and ask the question they were trained to ignore: who benefits? Officer Ryan Hayes learned to ask that question. Eve Hartwell proved that ownership can be stewardship, and that saving something small, a court, a kids program, a lawn, can save a handful of lives from drifting in ways no policy meeting could predict. Greenwood's courts held the day as they always had. But now, when dusk fell, lights might stay on a few minutes longer, not because the rule book changed, but because a community decided that rules must serve people, not the other way around. And if you walked by on any given night, you might catch a silver-haired woman laughing as she chased down a lob and a uniformed man applauding a kid's perfect forehand. You might hear the small, soft music of a town doing the hard work of looking after itself, one match at a time.